Hello everybody, and how are you? I'm hoping you're all doing well. I've had a busy day. What have I done? I got groceries. They were delivered and I had to unpack them and put them away, and I also had a Zoom meeting with a whole bunch of other people and that sort of thing. So yes, keeping really busy here. And we're currently in lockdown again here in New Zealand. For some parts of the country, they'll be going back to normal soon. And for some parts of the country, they will be staying in lockdown for at least the rest of the week, maybe longer. We'll see what happens, because apparently the version of COVID that's escaped into the wild in New Zealand is the Delta variant, which spreads very easily, and we want to stop it getting anywhere. So, staying home, wearing a mask. No worries, roosters. Good to have you here. You watch the news. You can let me know all about it, or on your own channel or whatever. But yeah, last I heard is like, I don't know quite what's going to happen next. So yeah, stay home, wear a mask, wash your hands lots, sanitizer, soap and water, whatever. Keep your distance from other people, stay within your bubble of your household, all of that sort of stuff. Use online where you can. Good stuff. A general note to everybody, I'm not specifically talking to you about that, roosters, because I know that you'll be doing that anyway. I'm just going to check some information over here on my other screen. Sorry. It's really weird seeing yourself on the monitor, because I don't have my view flipped so that it's the way I'm used to seeing it in the mirror. I have it so it's the way you would see me if you were seeing me face to face. Which means that things that are normal for me are now amplified, because it's a mirror image of what I normally see, because I see it in the mirror. So I notice that one of my eyes doesn't open as far as the other one unless I do it on purpose. Like, I don't know, I can't do it. It looks weird to me, but it's normal for you guys. So anyway, I am going to just check to see if there's anything I'm meant to be addressing over here that's to do with today, and it doesn't look like it. And then I am going to open up Twitch over on my other monitor so that I can see what's going on. Well, I kind of can anyway, but it's quite handy to actually have it open in another browser window. Whatever, you know. Roosters plays using streams using an Xbox, I think, which means that he'll be using a monitor or a TV screen or whatever. I'm using mine's on a computer, so I use a program called OBS, and also my browser and other bits and pieces like that. So what are we doing today? We are reading a story. I do have it here somewhere. I shall find it for you. We are reading a story called The Story of the Treasure Seekers, and it's by a lady whose stories we've had before. I'll just get the glare off me. It works better if you have more than one part of my face that's visible, but not looking the same everywhere. By a lady called Edith Nesbit. I'm finding it hard to move my mouse to just the right spot to be able to get the adjustment handle. Lady called Edith Nesbit. We've had one of her stories before, which is called The Railway Children, which is probably one of the most famous of her stories. And okay, hurry up and wake up, little iPad, so I can hit the resume button. Yes, it's working. She's done a whole lot of other children's stories. They are also early 20th century, I think. But they are public domain now, so that's why I'm quite happily reading them. Yes, I thought so, you do. Oh, that's a shame. Yeah, I heard you saying about Lightstream the other day. Sorry, I just commented. I'm telling people who are listening to this later, I was talking to Roosters the other day. I was watching Roosters playing the other day, and he mentioned that he uses his Xbox. But I don't have an Xbox. I've never had one. I've never used one, so I'm not quite so familiar with the systems. But yes, to be able to do an overlay on an Xbox when you're streaming, you need to have a sub to Lightstream. There's probably one or two other versions of that sort of thing, but you have to pay for it. even though you've already got hardware that you can use to use some of the other nice things that make it look interesting or different or give you other information. You have to pay a subscription for something. So everything I'm using on here at the moment is either a one-off cost, like my base overlay that I use at the moment is one that I did actually pay for, and it's one I'm happy to have paid for because I know I will keep using it for a long time. I will interchange it with other ones. I've got 2 that I've done that with, but that's it. Everything else I'm going to have a go at doing it graphically myself. But then I modify them. I stick other bits and pieces on because I'm using OBS. So I've put up above there, it says story time, and then it's got the title of the book and the author, and then it's got a picture of the book cover. All of that part I've put there because it covers another piece of information that they have, which is not appropriate for what we're doing, because this is not an intermission. This is all of what I do. I talk to you here while I'm reading a book. It's not between other things, which is what intermission is. So it's really interesting to see how different people do different things on their computers and things. Sorry, I'm just changing it so I'm not looking like I'm sitting on the floor. Anyway, what are we up to? We are Story of the Treasure Seekers. We're reading part 2. I'm just writing this into the thing. That's probably actually going to be out of date now already. And I'm going to start reading. And Roosters, you just keep listening to the news. Keep listening to the news. Somebody needs to. And it won't be me today because I'm reading right when they're doing their announcement. In New Zealand, they usually do their announcements at 1 o'clock. Today, they're doing it at 3. Just because COVID community cases are a fairly new thing again for us here in New Zealand. So we're going to carry on. So we are reading The Story of the Treasure Seekers by Edith Nesbit, E. Nesbit. And it is one of the books in a series. There's 3 books that she wrote about the Bastable children. This is the first one, and we are reading chapter 3, which is called Being Detectives. The next thing that happened to us was very interesting. It was as real as the half-crowns, not just pretending. I shall try to write it as like a real book as I can. Of course, we have read Mr. Sherlock Holmes as well as the yellow-covered books with pictures outside that are so badly printed, and you get them for 4pence halfpenny at the bookstall when the corners of them are beginning to curl up and get dirty, with people looking to see how the story ends when they're waiting for trains. So they're talking about cheap books that were available at the time when this was written. I think this is most unfair to the boy at the bookstall. The books are written by a gentleman named Gaboriau, and Albert's uncle says they're the worst translations in the world and written in vile English. So apparently they're some sort of adventure stories by this chap, and they have been translated into English from French. Of course, they're not like Kipling, but they're jolly good stories. Kipling is another author, English author, whose books that some of us will have heard. Sorry, I'm going to adjust this again. That's a bit better. Rudyard Kipling wrote the Just So stories, Stalky and Co. There's a whole lot of stuff, really old ones. Anyway, they're not like the Kipling, but they're jolly good stories, and we had just been reading a book by Dick Didlington. That's not his right name, but I know all about libel actions, so I shall not say what his name is really, because his books are rot. Only they put it into our heads to do what I'm going to narrate. It was in September, and we were not to go to the seaside because it is so expensive, even if you go to Sheerness, where it's all tin cans and old boots and no sand at all. But everyone else went, even the people next door, not Albert's side, but the other one. Their servant told Eliza they were all going to Scarborough, and the next day, sure enough, all the blinds were down and the shutters up, and the milk was not left any more. There's a big horse-chestnut tree between their garden and ours, very useful for getting conkers out of, and for making stuff to rub on your chilblains. So that's another thing you can look up. Chilblain treatment, horse-chestnuts. This prevented our seeing whether the blinds were down at the back as well, but Dickie climbed to the top of the tree and looked, and they were. It was jolly hot weather and very stuffy indoors. We used to play a good deal in the garden. We made a tent out of the kitchen clothes horse and some blankets off our beds, and thought it was quite as hot in the tent as in the house. It was a very different, though it was quite as hot in the tent as in the house, it was a very different sort of hotness. Albert's uncle called it the Turkish bath, which has a lot of steam. It is not nice to be kept from the seaside, but we know that we have much to be thankful for. We might be poor little children living in a crowded alley, where even at summer noon hardly a ray of sunshine penetrates, clothed in rags and with bare feet, though I do not mind holes in my clothes myself, and bare feet would not be at all bad in this sort of weather. Indeed, we do sometimes when we're playing at things which require it. It was shipwrecked mariners that day, I remember. Oh, they're in England. Children don't go round in bare feet. I'm in New Zealand. I went round in bare feet. My mother, who is a Kiwi, actually spent her first few years in Canada, which is similar to England for that, and also they have much colder weather there than they do in this part of New Zealand. And when she first came back to New Zealand, she was old enough now to see what was going on around her and see that it was different. And so she said to her mother, when they were driving to where they were going to be living, she said, "Mummy, look at all those poor children." And her mum, who's a Kiwi who's lived here most of her life, said, "What poor children?" And my mother said to her mother, "The ones without the shoes," because where she came from in Canada, if you didn't have shoes on, you were very poor. So there you go. This is. Anyway, so indeed we do sometimes wear bare feet when we were playing at things which require it. It was the shipwrecked mariners that day, I remember, and we were all in the blanket tent. We had just finished eating the things we had saved at the peril of our lives from the sinking vessel. They were rather nice things. 2 pennyworth of coconut candy. It was not in Greenwich, where it's 4 ounces a penny. 3 apples. It was got in Greenwich, where it's 4 ounces a penny. So that's quite a bit. 3 apples, some macaroni, the straight sort that's so useful to suck things through, some raw rice, and a large piece of cold suet pudding that Alice nicked from the larder when she went to get the rice and macaroni. And when we had finished, someone said, "I should like to be a detective." I wish to be quite fair, but I cannot remember exactly who said it. Oswald thinks he said it, and Dora says it was Dicky, but Oswald is too much of a man to quarrel about a little thing like that. Is anyone getting the idea that maybe Oswald is actually the one who's writing the story? The way he's favoured in some of the descriptions? Trying to pretend that it could be any of them. I should like... Oswald is too much of a man to quarrel about a little thing like that. I should like to be a detective, said, perhaps it was Dicky, but I think not, and find out strange and hidden crimes. You have to be much cleverer than you are, said H.O. Not so very, said Alice, because when you've read the books you know what the things mean, the red hair on the handle of the knife, or the grains of white powder on the velvet collar of the villain's overcoat. I believe we could do it. I shouldn't like to have anything to do with murders, said Dora. Somehow it doesn't seem safe. And it always ends in the poor murderer being hanged, said Alice, back in the day when hangings were still a common punishment. We explained to her why murderers have to be hanged, but she only said, I don't care, I'm sure no one would ever do murdering twice. Think of the blood and things and what you would see when you woke up in the night. I shouldn't mind being a detective to lie in wait for a gang of coiners now, and spring upon them unawares and secure them single-handed, you know, or with only my faithful bloodhound. So coiners are people who make fake coins. Forgers, I think. She stroked Pincher's ears, her faithful bloodhound, but he had gone to sleep because he knew well enough that all the suet pudding was finished. He is a very sensible dog. You always get hold of the wrong end of the stick, Oswald said. You can't choose what crimes you'll be a detective about. You just have to get a suspicious circumstance and then you look for a clue and follow it up. Whether it turns out a murder or a missing will is just a fluke. That's one way, Dicky said. Another is to get a paper and find 2 advertisements or bits of news that fit, like this, young lady missing, and then it tells about all the clothes she had on and the gold locket she wore and the colour of her hair and all that. And then in another piece of the paper you see gold locket found, and then it all comes out. We sent H over the paper at once, but we could not make any of the things fit in. The two best were about how some burglars broke into a place in Holloway where they made preserved tongues and invalid delicacies and carried off a lot of them. Foods made from organ meats, because they've got really, really high nutrient levels, because the different organs like kidneys and livers and things like that have a lot of different high food values to them. So they were made as food for invalids, and carried off a lot of them. And on another page there was mysterious deaths in Holloway. Oswald thought there was something in it, and so did Albert's uncle when we asked him, but the others thought not, so Oswald agreed to drop it. Besides, Holloway is a long way off. All the time we were talking about the paper, Alice seemed to be thinking about something else, and when we had done, she said, "I believe we might be detectives ourselves, but I should not like to get anybody into trouble." "Not murderers or robbers?" Dickie asked. "It wouldn't be murderers," she said, "but I have noticed something strange. Only I feel a little frightened. Let's ask Albert's uncle first." Alice is a jolly sight too fond of asking grown-up people things, and we all said it was tommy rot and she was to tell us. "Well, promise you won't do anything without me," Alice said, and we promised. And then she said, "This is a dark secret, and anyone who thinks it is better not be involved in a career of crime discovery. And anyone who thinks it is better not to be involved in a career of crime discovery had better go away ere yet it be too late." So Dora said she'd had enough of tents and she was going to look at the shops. H.O. went with her because he had twopence to spend. They thought it was only a game of Alice's, but Oswald knew by the way she spoke. He can nearly always tell. And when people are not telling the truth, Oswald generally knows by the way they look in their eyes. Oswald is not proud of being able to do this. He knows it is through no merit of his own that he is much cleverer than some people. Who thinks it's Oswald that's the author in the story? When they had gone, the rest of us got closer together and said, "Now then." "Well," Alice said, "you know the house next door, the people have gone to Scarborough, and the house is shut up. But last night I saw a light in the windows." We asked her how and when, because her room is in the front and she couldn't possibly have seen, and then she said, "I'll tell you boys if you will promise not ever to go fishing again without me." So we had to promise. Then she said, "It was last night. I had forgotten to feed my rabbits and I woke up and remembered it. And I was afraid I should find them dead in the morning, like Oswald did." "It wasn't my fault," Oswald said. "There was something the matter with the beasts. I fed them right enough." Alice said she didn't mean that, and she went on. "I came down into the garden and I saw a light in the house and dark figures moving about. I thought perhaps it was burglars, but Father hadn't come home and Eliza had gone to bed, so I couldn't do anything. Only I thought perhaps I would tell the rest of you." "Why didn't you tell us this morning?" Noel asked, and Alice explained that she did not want to get anyone into trouble, even burglars. "But we might watch tonight," she said, "and see if we see the light again." "They might have been burglars," Noel said. He was sucking the last bit of his macaroni. "You know, the people next door are very grand. They won't know us, and they go out in a real private carriage sometimes, and they have an at-home day, and people come in cabs. I dare say they have piles of plate and jewellery and rich brocades and furs of price and things like that. Let us keep watch tonight." The phrasing is very typical for the sort of stories that they would have been reading. "It's no use watching tonight," Dickie said. "If it's only burglars, they won't come again. But there are other things besides burglars that are discovered in empty houses where lights are seen moving." "You mean coiners?" said Oswald at once. "I wonder what the reward is for setting the police on their track." Dickie thought it ought to be something fat. worth a lot, because coiners are always a desperate gang, and the machinery they make the coins with is so heavy and handy for knocking down detectives. Then it was tea time, and we went in, and Dora and H.O. had clubbed their muddy together and bought a melon, quite a big one, and only a little bit squashy at one end. It was very good, and then we washed the seeds and made things with them, with pins and cotton, and nobody said any more about watching the house next door. Only when we went to bed, Dickie took off his coat and waistcoat, but he stopped at his braces and said, "What about the coiners?" Oswald had taken off his collar and tie, and he was just going to say the same, so he said, "Of course I meant to watch, only my collar's rather tight, so I thought I'd take it off first." Back in the days where you had a shirt that came up to here, and then you had collar studs, and you clipped your collar on, because the collar was made out of a different thing. It wasn't fabric, it was probably some form of celluloid, and it could be a bit uncomfortable, but it always stayed looking a lot more crisp and fresh than fabric would have in that day and age. Dickie said he did not think the girls ought to be in it, because there might be danger, but Oswald reminded him that they had promised Alice, and that a promise is a sacred thing, even when you'd much rather not. So Oswald got Alice alone under pretence of showing her a caterpillar. Dora does not like them, and she screamed and ran away when Oswald offered to show it to her. Then Oswald explained, and Alice agreed to come and watch if she could. This made us later than we ought to have been, because Alice had to wait till Dora was quiet, and then crept out very slowly for fear of the boards creaking. The girls sleep with their room door open for fear of burglars. Alice had kept on her clothes under her nightgown when Dora wasn't looking, and presently we got down, creeping past Father's study and out at the glass door that leads onto the veranda and the iron steps into the garden. And we went down very quietly and got into the chestnut tree, and then I felt that we had only been playing what Albert's uncle calls our favourite instrument, the fool. For the house next door was as dark as dark. Then suddenly we heard a sound. It came from the gate at the end of the garden. All the gardens have gates. They lead into a kind of lane that runs behind them. It's a sort of back way, very convenient if you don't want to say exactly where you are going. Back in those days, it was also the lane that was used for rubbish collection, the night carts, which is like toilet waste, milk delivery, all that sort of stuff. A little wee alleyway that ran between the backyards of the houses, and so any of the services and stuff were supplied through that way. That would include groceries and things too, probably. We don't build that way in this part of the world. We heard the gate at the end of the next garden click, and Dickie nudged Alice so that she would have fallen out of the tree if it had not been for Oswald's extraordinary presence of mind. Oswald squeezed Alice's arm tight, and we all looked. And the others were rather frightened, because really we had not exactly expected anything to happen, except perhaps a light. But now a muffled figure, shrouded in a dark cloak, came swiftly up the path of the next door garden. Just make sure that I haven't got things touching things that are going to get hot. Sorry, I've just turned the lava lamp on, and it's next to the cable for the microphone, and I don't want to melt it. The others were rather frightened, because really we had not exactly expected anything to happen except perhaps a light. But now a muffled figure shrouded in a dark cloak came swiftly up the path of the next door garden, and we could see that under its cloak the figure carried a mysterious burden. The figure was dressed to look like a woman in a sailor hat. We held our breath as it passed under the tree where we were, and then it tapped very gently on the back door and was let in, and then a light appeared in the window of the downstairs back breakfast room, but the shutters were up. Dickie said, "My eye!" and wouldn't the others be sick to think they hadn't been in this? But Alice didn't half like it, and as she is a girl, I do not blame her. Indeed, I thought myself at first that perhaps it would be better to retire for the present and return later with a strongly armed force. "It's not burglars," Alice whispered. "The mysterious stranger was bringing things in, not taking them out. They must be coiners. And, oh, Oswald, don't let's. The thing they coin with must hurt very much. Do let's go to bed." But Dickie said he was going to see. If there was a reward for finding out things like this, he would like to have the reward. "They locked the back door," he whispered. "I heard it go, and I could look in quite well through the holes in the shutters, and be back over the wall long before they'd got the door open, even if they started to do it at once." There were holes at the top of the shutters, the shape of hearts, and the yellow light came out through them as well as through the chinks of the shutters. Oswald said if Dickie went he should, because he was the eldest, and Alice said if anyone goes it ought to be me, because I thought of it. So Oswald said, "Well, go then." And she said, "Not for anything." And she begged us not to. And we talked about it in the tree till we were all quite hoarse with whispering. At last we decided on a plan of action. Alice was to stay in the tree and scream "Murder!" if anything happened. Dickie and I were to get down into the next garden and take it in turns to peep. So we got down as quietly as we could, but the tree made much more noise than it does in the day, and several times we paused, fearing that all was discovered, but nothing happened. Have you ever noticed that? Noises are a lot louder in the dark than they are in the light. If you want people to be quiet, turn the light off. If you want them to talk more loudly, then turn the light on. I don't know why, but it works. I've tried it many times. Nothing happened. There was a pile of red flower pots under the window, and one very large one was on the window ledge. It seemed as if it was the hand of destiny that placed it there, and the geranium in it was dead, so there was nothing to stop your standing on it. So Oswald did. He went first because he was the eldest, and though Dickie tried to stop him because he thought of it first, it could not be on account of not being able to say anything. So Oswald stood on the flower pot and tried to look through one of the holes. He did not really expect to see the coiners at their fell work, though he had pretended to when we were talking in the tree. But if he had seen them pouring the base molten metal into tin moulds the shape of half-crowns, he would not have been half so astonished as he was at the spectacle now revealed. At first he could see little, because the hole had unfortunately been made a little too high, so that the eye of the detective could only see the prodigal son in a shiny frame on the opposite wall. That's a picture, a famous picture. But Oswald held on to the window frame and stood on tiptoe, and then he saw. There was no furnace and no base metal, no bearded men in leather aprons with tongs and things, but just a table with a tablecloth on it for supper, and a tin of salmon, and a lettuce, and some bottled beer. And there on the chair was the cloak and the hat of the mysterious stranger. And the two people sitting at the table were the two youngest grown-up daughters of the lady next door. And one of them was saying, "So I got the salmon 3 halfpence cheaper, and the lettuces are only 6 a penny in the Broadway. Just fancy! We must save as much money as ever we can on our housekeeping money, if we want to go away decent next year." And the other said, "I wish we could all go every year, or else, really, I almost wish." And all the time Oswald was looking, Dickie was pulling at his jacket to make him get down and let Dickie have a squint. And just as she said, "I almost," Dickie pulled too hard. And Oswald felt himself toppling on the giddy verge of the big flower pots. Putting forth all his strength, our hero strove to recover his what's-its-name, but it was lost now beyond recall. "You've done it this time," he said. Then he fell heavily among the flower pots piled below. He heard them crash and rattle and crack, and then his head struck against an iron pillar used for holding up the next-door veranda. His eyes closed, and he knew no more. Now you will perhaps expect that at this moment Alice would have cried "Murder!" If you think so, you little know what girls are. Directly she was left alone in that tree, she made a bolt to tell Albert's uncle all about it and bring him to our rescue in case the coiners' gang was a very desperate one. And just when I fell, Albert's uncle was getting over the wall. Alice never screamed at all when Oswald fell, but Dickie thinks he heard Albert's uncle say, "Confound those kids," which would not have been kind or polite, so I hope he did not say it. The people next door did not come out to see what the row was. Albert's uncle did not wait for them to come out. He picked up Oswald and carried the insensible boy of the gallant young detective to the wall, laid it on the top, and then climbed over and bore his lifeless burden into our house and put it on the sofa in Father's study. Father was out, so we needn't have crept so when we were getting into the garden. Then Oswald was restored to consciousness and his head tied up, because he would have banged it quite badly, and sent to bed, and next day there was a lump on his young brow as big as a turkey's egg and very uncomfortable. Albert's uncle came in the next day and talked to each of us separately. To Oswald he said many unpleasant things about ungentlemanly to spy on ladies and about minding your own business. And when I began to tell him what I heard, he told me to shut up, and altogether he made me more uncomfortable than the bump did. Oswald did not say anything to anyone, but next day, as the shadows of eve were falling, he crept away and wrote on a piece of paper, "I want to speak to you," and shoved it through the hole, like a heart, at the top of the next door shutters, and the youngest young lady put an eye to the heart-shaped hole and then opened the shutter and said, "Well?" very crossly. Then Oswald said, "I am very sorry, and I beg your pardon. We wanted to be detectives, and we thought a gang of coiners infested your house, so we looked through your window last night. I saw the lettuce, and I heard what you said about the salmon being 3 halfpence cheaper, and I know it's very dishonourable to pry into other people's secrets, especially ladies, and I never will again if you will forgive me this once." Then the lady frowned, and then she laughed, and then she said, "So it was you tumbling into the flower pots last night. We thought it was burglars. It frightened us horribly. Why, what a bump on your poor head." And then she talked to me a bit, and presently she said she and her sister had not wished people to know that they were at home because... And then she stopped short and grew very red, and I said, "I thought you were all at Scarborough. Your servant told Eliza so. Why didn't you want people to know you were at home?" The lady got redder still, and then she laughed and said, "Never mind the reason why. I hope your head doesn't hurt much. Thank you for your nice manly little speech. You've nothing to be ashamed of at any rate." Then she kissed me, and I did not mind. And then she said, "Run away now, dear. I'm going to pull up the blinds and open the shutters, and I want to do it at once before it gets dark so that everyone can see we're at home and not in Scarborough." We're in lockdown until 11:59 p.m. Tuesday. Yes. I'm in Auckland, so I would have been anyway. I don't know. I'm guessing that that's Wellington, because Wellington has, last I heard, 3 cases, and they have 3 cases because... Sorry, yes, this is the end of the chapter, so I'm allowed to talk now. Wellington has 3 cases because the people who are those cases were in Auckland prior to going back down to Wellington. They were in Auckland for the weekend or something like that. Thank you for finding out and telling us. Yeah, I'm going to have a drink of water now, which is what you're going to do. All of New Zealand, okay, because that makes a lot of sense, because those people, the first case or cases, went to a lot of places and people have travelled a lot since then, so it makes a lot of sense that we're all in lockdown until midnight Tuesday. So, yes, it's one of those, let's do something about it, and let's do it really strongly so that we can make enough of a difference. And I feel a bit sorry for the people who think it's all a hoax, because they must be getting very frustrated. I'm just moving my microphone. Since I'm not typing, I can put it where I usually have it. It was a bit more like what I'm used to. Yeah, I was in a Zoom meeting and I was doing a lot of typing, and my microphone picks up the typing really, really easily. So I moved it off my keyboard stand and off my desk to the other desk that's alongside me. So, how is everybody and how have you been doing? And those of you who are in New Zealand, how are you coping with lockdown so far? Is it different to normal or is it same? Some people are a bit like me and they prefer to be at home when they can. Thankfully, all the work that I do, I'm based at home for because we have a business that we run from our home. Which involves me taking photographs of the wood turning that my husband does and putting them onto our website to sell them. And he writes up the descriptions and then I put them onto the website too, that sort of thing. And I read stories. That's what I do for fun. One of the things I do for fun. I used to play a few computer games, but the sort of games I play are not the typical ones that are streamed on Twitch. They tend to be more puzzle adventure games. I'm not good at shooting games. I'm terrible at timing. I'm not sure if it's me or if it's my computer, if it's my mouse settings, but I'm terrible at them. I've always been terrible at them. But thinking ones, puzzling things, I'm usually reasonable. I'll use walkthroughs sometimes if I'm not having fun figuring out what I need to do. I think that's okay to use a walkthrough if you need to, because a game is meant to be for fun. So, I need another drink of water. Particularly throat. No, it's not COVID. It's not. I get indigestion and it irritates my throat. And I have done for years. Anyway, and that squeaky noise is my water bottle. Have you had your drink? Go and make a cup of tea. Have a quick trip to the loo if you need to. And you won't miss much because the beginning of a chapter is usually not too significant. But I'm going to carry on reading. Oh dear, I think I need to turn my level down slightly because I am peaking, which means it will be clipping and sounding weird. So we'll see how that goes. That should be a bit better. I'm not getting up to the read now. Sorry, I'm looking at the meter down below. The Story of the Treasure Seekers by Edith Nesbit. Chapter 4, Good Hunting. And since it's just after 3:30, I've got enough time to read at least this chapter, maybe another one, because this is another book that has shorter chapters. Chapter 4, Good Hunting. When we had got that 4 shillings by digging for treasure, we ought by rights to have tried Dicky's idea of answering the advertisement about ladies and gentlemen and spare time and £2 a week. But there were several things we rather wanted. Dora wanted a new pair of scissors, and she said she was going to get them with her 8p. But Alice said, "You ought to get her those, Oswald, because you know you broke the points off hers getting the marble out of the brass thimble." It was quite true, though I had almost forgotten it. But then it was H.O. who jammed the marble into the thimble first of all, so I said, "It's H.O.'s fault as much as mine anyhow. Why shouldn't he pay?" Oswald didn't so much mind paying for the beastly scissors, but he hates injustice of every kind. "He's such a little kid," said Dicky, and of course H.O. said he wasn't a little kid, and it very nearly came to being a row between them. But Oswald knows when to be generous, so he said, "Look here, I'll pay 6p of the scissors, and H.O. shall pay the rest, to teach him to be careful." H.O. agreed. He is not at all a mean kid, but I found out afterwards that Alice paid his share out of her own money. Then we wanted some new paints, and Noel wanted a pencil and a halfpenny account book to write poetry with, and it does seem hard never to have any apples. So somehow or other nearly all the money got spent, and we agreed that we must let the advertisement run loose a little longer. "I only hope," said Alice, "that they won't have got all the ladies and gentlemen they want before we have got the money to write for the sample and instructions." And I was a little afraid myself, because it seemed such a splendid chance, but we looked in the paper every day, and the advertisement was always there, so we thought it was all right. Then we had the detective try on, and it proved no go, and then when all the money was gone except a halfpenny of mine and 2p of Noel's and 3p of Dicky's and a few pennies that the girls had left, we held another council. Dora was sewing the buttons on H.O.'s Sunday things. He got himself a knife with his money, and he cut every single one of his best buttons off. You've no idea how many buttons there are on a suit. Dora counted them. There are 24, counting the little ones on the sleeves that don't undo. He was testing out that knife, wasn't he? Alice was trying to teach Pincher to beg, but he has too much sense when he knows you've got nothing in your hands, and the rest of us were roasting potatoes under the fire. We had made a fire on purpose, though it was rather warm. They are very good if you cut away the burnt parts, the potatoes, but you ought to wash them first, or you are a dirty boy. Well, what can we do, said Dicky. You are so fond of saying, let's do something, and never saying what. We can't try the advertisement yet. Shall we try rescuing someone, said Oswald. It was his own idea, but he didn't insist on doing it, though he is next to the eldest, for he knows it is bad manners to make people do what you want, when they would rather not. What was Noel's plan? Alice asked. A princess or a poetry book, said Noel sleepily. He was lying on his back on the sofa, kicking his legs. Only I shall look for the princess all by myself, but I'll let you see her when we're married. Have you got enough poetry to make into a book? Dicky asked, and it was rather sensible of him, because when Noel came to look, there were only 7 of his poems that any of us could understand. There was The Wreck of the Malabar, and the poem he wrote when Eliza took us to hear the reviving preacher, and everybody cried, and Father said it must have been the preacher's eloquence. So Noel wrote, O eloquence, and what art thou? Aye, what art thou? Because we cried, and everybody cried inside, and when they came out their eyes were red, and it was your doing, Father said. But Noel told Alice he got the first line and a half from a book a boy at school was going to write when he had time. Besides this, there was the lines on a dead black beetle that was poisoned. That's the title. Lines on a dead black beetle that was poisoned. O beetle, how I weep to see thee lying on thy poor back. It is so very sad indeed, you were so shiny and black. I wish you were alive again, but Eliza says wishing it is nonsense and a shame. It was a very good beetle poison, and there were hundreds of them lying dead, but Noel only wrote a piece of poetry for one of them. He said he hadn't time to do them all, and the worst of it was he didn't know which one he'd written it to, so Alice couldn't bury the beetle and put the lines on its grave, though she wanted to very much. Well, it was quite plain that there wasn't enough poetry for a book. We might wait a year or 2, said Noel. I shall be sure to make some more sometime. I thought of a piece about a fly this morning that knew condensed milk was sticky. But we want the money now, said Dicky, and you can go on writing just the same. It will come in some time or other. There's poetry in newspapers, said Alice. Down, Pincher. You'll never be a clever dog, so it's no good trying. Do they pay for it? Dicky thought of that. He often thinks of things that are really important, even if they are a little dull. I don't know, but I shouldn't think anyone would let them print poetry without. I wouldn't know. That was Dora, but Noel said he wouldn't mind if he didn't get paid, so long as he saw his poetry printed and his name at the end. We might try anyway, said Oswald. He's always willing to give other people's ideas a fair trial. So we copied out The Wreck of the Malabar and the other 6 poems on drawing paper. Dora did it, she writes best, and Oswald drew a picture of the Malabar going down with all hands. It was a full-rigged schooner, and all the ropes and sails were correct, because my cousin is in the Navy, and he showed me. We thought a long time about whether we'd write a letter and send it by post with the poetry, and Dora thought it would be best, but Noel said he couldn't bear to not know at once if the paper would print the poetry. So we decided to take it. I went with Noel because I'm the eldest, and he's not old enough to go to London by himself. Dicky said poetry was rot, and he was glad he hadn't got to make a fool of himself. That was because there was not enough money for him to go with us. H.O. couldn't come either, but he came to the station to see us off and waved his cap and called out, "Good hunting," as the train started. There was a lady in spectacles in the corner. She was writing with a pencil on the edges of long strips of paper that had print all down them. When the train started, she asked, "What was that he said?" So Oswald answered, "It was good hunting. It's out of the Jungle Book." "That's very pleasant to hear," the lady said. "I'm very pleased to meet people who know their Jungle Book. And where are you off to?" the zoological gardens to look for Bagheera. We were pleased, too, to meet someone who knew the Jungle Book. That's one that's written by Rudyard Kipling, by the way. So Oswald said, that's the one I couldn't remember that's very famous. Oswald said, we are going to restore the fallen fortunes of the House of Bastable, and we have all thought of different ways, and we're going to try them all. Noel's way is poetry. I suppose great poets get paid. The lady laughed. She was awfully jolly, and said she was sort of a poet too, and the long strips of paper were the proofs of her new book of stories. Because before a book is made into a real book with pages and a cover, they sometimes print it all on strips of paper, and the writer makes marks on it with a pencil to show the printers what idiots they are not to understand what a writer means to be printed. We told her all about digging for treasure and what we meant to do. Then she asked to see Noel's poetry, and he said he didn't like. So she said, look here, if you'll show me yours, I'll show you some of mine. So he agreed. The jolly lady read Noel's poetry, and she said she liked it very much, and she thought a great deal of the picture of the Malabar. And then she said, I write serious poetry like yours myself too, but I have a piece here that I think you will like because it's about a boy. She gave it to us, and so I can copy it down, and I will, for it shows that some grown-up ladies are not so silly as others. I like it better than Noel's poetry, though I told him I did not, because he looked as if he was going to cry. This is very wrong, for you should always speak the truth, however unhappy it makes people, and I generally do, but I did not want him crying in the railway carriage. The lady's piece of poetry. Oh, when I wake up in my bed and see the sun all fat and red, I'm glad to have another day for all my different kinds of play. There are so many things to do, the things that make a man of you, if grown-ups did not get so vexed and wonder what you will do next. I often wonder whether they ever made up our kinds of play, if they were always good as gold and only did what they were told. They like you best to play with tops and toys and boxes bought in shops. They do not even know the names of really interesting games. They will not let you play with fire or trip your sister with a wire. They grudge the tea tray for a drum or booby traps when callers come. They don't like fishing, and it's true you sometimes soak a suit or two. They look on fireworks, though they're dry, with quite a disapproving eye. They do not understand the way to get the most out of your day. They do not know how hunger feels, nor what you need between your meals. And when you're sent to bed at night, they're happy, but they're not polite. For through the door you hear them say, he's done his mischief for the day. She told us a lot of other pieces, but I cannot remember them, and she talked to us all the way up, and when we got nearly to Cannon Street, she said, I've got 2 shillings here. Do you think they would help to smooth the path to fame? Noel said, thank you, and was going to take the shilling, but Oswald, who always remembers what he is told, said, thank you very much, but father told us we ought never to take anything from strangers. That's a nasty one, said the lady. She didn't talk a bit like a real lady, but more like a jolly sort of grown-up boy in a dress and hat. A very nasty one, saying, that is. But don't you think, as Noel and I are both poets, I might be considered a sort of relation? You've heard of brother poets, haven't you? Don't you think Noel and I are aunt and nephew poets, or some relationship of that kind? I didn't know what to say, and she went on, it's awfully straight of you to stick to what your father tells you, but look here, you take the shillings, and here's my card. When you get home, tell your father all about it, and if he says no, you can just bring the shillings back to me. So we took the shillings, and she shook hands with us and said goodbye and good hunting. We did tell father about it, and he said it was all right, and when he looked at the card, he told us we were highly honoured, for the lady wrote better poetry than any other lady alive now, and we had never heard of her, and she seemed much too jolly for a poet. Good old Kipling. We owe him those 2 shillings as well as the Jungle Books. And that's the last page of that chapter. I wonder if, because we had this with the railway children, I wonder how much the character of the writer is autobiographical, because in the railway children it talked about the mother writing children's stories and poems and sending them off to magazines. And when I looked up Edith Nesbit, apparently they went through a stage where they were very poor And the one thing she could do was write stories and poems, and she used to send them off to be published. And she obviously refined her craft because we still have her books to read. And things did get better for them. So it does sound a little bit autobiographical, doesn't it? Putting a bit of her own experience into the story. And I'm going to read the next chapter. We are oh, no, drink of water. And you need to drink your water too, or a cup of tea or coffee or whatever it is. Your little tipple. The Story of the Treasure Seekers by E. Nesbit. Chapter 5. The Poet and the Editor. It was not bad sport, being in London entirely on your own hook. We asked the way to Fleet Street, where father says all the newspaper offices are. They said straight on down Ludgate Hill, but it turned out to be quite another way. At least we didn't go straight on. We got to St. Paul's. Noel would go in, and we saw where Gordon was buried, at least the monument. It is very flat, considering what a man he was. When we came out, we walked a long way, and when we asked a policeman, he said we'd better go back through Smithfield. So we did. They don't burn people any more there now, so it was rather dull, besides being a long way, and Noel got very tired. He's a peaky little chap. It comes of being a poet, I think. We had a bun or two at different shops, out of the shillings, and it was quite late in the afternoon when we got to Fleet Street. The gas was lighted, and the electric lights. There is a jolly Bovril sign that comes off and on in different coloured lamps. We went to the Daily Recorder office and asked to see the editor. It is a big office, very bright, with brass and mahogany and electric lights. They told us the editor wasn't there, but at another office, so we went down a dirty street to a very dull-looking place. There was a man there inside in a glass case, as if he was a museum, and he told us to write down our names and our business. So Oswald wrote, Oswald Bastable, Noel Bastable, business very private indeed. Then we waited on the stone stairs. It was very draughty, and the man in the glass case looked at us as if we were the museum instead of him. We waited a long time, and then a boy came down and said, The editor can't see you. Will you please write your business? And he laughed. I wanted to punch his head. But Noel said, Yes, I'll write it if you give me a pen and ink and a sheet of paper and an envelope. The boy said he'd better write by post, but Noel is a bit pig-headed. It's his worst fault. So he said, No, I'll write it now. So I backed him up by saying, Look at the price penny stamps are since the coal strike. So the boy grinned, and the man in the glass case gave us pen and paper, and Noel wrote. Oswald writes better than he does, but Noel would do it, and it took a very long time, and then it was inky. Dear Mr. Editor, I want you to print my poetry and pay for it. And I am a friend of Mrs. Leslie's. She is a poet too. Your affectionate friend, Noel Bastable. He licked the envelope a good deal so that the boy shouldn't read it going upstairs, and he wrote very private outside and gave the letter to the boy. I thought it wasn't any good, but in a minute the grinning boy came back, and he was quite respectful and said, The editor says, please will you step up? We stepped up. There were a lot of stairs and passages and a queer sort of hammering sound and a very funny smell. The boy was now very polite and said it was the ink we smelt and the noise was the printing machines. After going through a lot of cold passages, we came to a door and the boy opened it and left us to go in. There was a large room with a big soft blue and red carpet and a roaring fire, though it was only October, and a large table with drawers and littered with papers, just like the one in Father's study. A gentleman was sitting at one side of the table. He had a light moustache and light eyes, and he looked very young to be an editor, not nearly so old as Father. He looked very tired and sleepy, as if he had got up very early in the morning, but he was kind, and we liked him. Oswald thought he looked clever. Oswald is considered a judge of faces. Well, said he, so you are Mrs. Leslie's friends? I think so, said Noel. At least she gave us each a shilling, and she wished us good hunting. Good hunting, eh? Well, what about this poetry of yours? Which is the poet? I can't think how he could have asked. Oswald is said to be a very manly-looking boy for his age. However, I thought it would look duffing to be offended, so I said, "This is my brother Noel. He is the poet." Noel had turned quite pale. Excuse me a moment. My voice reading. "This is my brother Noel. He's the poet." Noel had turned quite pale. He is disgustingly like a girl in some ways. The editor told us to sit down, and he took the poems from Noel and began to read them. Noel got paler and paler. I really thought he was going to faint, like he did when I held his hand under the cold water tap after I accidentally cut him with my chisel. When the editor had read the first poem, it was the one about the beetle, he got up and stood with his back to us. It was not manners, but Noel thinks he did it to conceal his emotion, as they do in books. He read all the poems, and then he said, "I like your poetry very much, young man. I'll give you, let me see, how much shall I give you for it?" "As much as ever you can," said Noel. "You can see I want a good deal of money to restore the fallen fortunes of the house of Bastable." The gentleman put on some eyeglasses and looked hard at us. Then he sat down. "That's a good idea," said he. "Tell me how you came to think of it. And I say, have you had any tea? They've just sent out for mine." He rang a tingly bell, and the boy brought in a tray with a teapot and a thick cup and saucer and things, and he had to fetch another tray for us when he was told to, and we had tea with the editor of the Daily Recorder. I suppose it was a very proud moment for Noel, though I did not think of it till afterwards. The editor asked us a lot of questions, and we told him a good deal, though of course I did not tell a stranger all our reasons for thinking that the family fortunes wanted restoring. We stayed about half an hour, and when we were going away he said again, "I shall print all your poems, my poet, and now what do you think they are worth?" "I don't know," Noel said. "You see, I didn't write them to sell." "Why did you write them then?" he asked. Noel said he didn't know. He supposed because he wanted to. "Art for art's sake, eh?" said the editor, and he seemed quite delighted, as though Noel had said something clever. "Well, would a guinea meet your views?" he asked. I had read of people being at a loss for words and dumb with emotion, and I've read of people being turned to stone with astonishment or joy or something, but I never knew how silly it looked till I saw Noel standing staring at the editor with his mouth open. He went red, and he went white, and then he got crimson as if you were rubbing more and more crimson lake on a palette. That's a paint palette. But he didn't say a word, so Oswald had to say, "I should jolly well think so." So the editor gave Noel a sovereign and a shilling, and then he shook hands with us both, but he thumped Noel on the back and said, "Buck up, old man, it's your first guinea, but it won't be your last. Now go along home, and in about 10 years you can bring me some more poetry. Not before, see? I'm just taking this poetry of yours because I like it very much, but we don't put poetry in this paper at all. I shall have to put it in another paper I know of." "What do you put in your paper?" I asked, for father always takes the Daily Chronicle, and I didn't know what the Recorder was like. We chose it because it had such a glorious office and a clock outside lighted up. "Oh, news," said he, "and dull articles and things about celebrities. If you know any celebrities now?" Noel asked him what celebrities were. "Oh, the Queen and the princes and people with titles and people who write or sing or act or do something clever or wicked." "I don't know anybody wicked," said Oswald, wishing he had known Dick Turpin or Claude Duval, so as to be able to tell the editor things about them. "But I know someone with a title, Lord Tottenham." "The mad old protectionist, eh? How did you come to know him?" "We don't know him to speak to, but he goes over the heath every day at 3, and he strides along like a giant, with a black cloak like Lord Tennyson's flying behind him, and he talks to himself like 1 o'clock. "What does he say?" said the editor. He had sat down again, and he was fiddling with a blue pencil. "We only heard him once, close enough to understand, and then he said, 'The curse of the country, sir, ruin and desolation,' and then he went striding along again, hitting at the furze bushes as if they were the heads of his enemies." Furze, for those of you in New Zealand, is gorse, or if you're in Ireland, the whins. Excellent descriptive touch, said the editor. Well, go on. That's all I know about him, except that he stops in the middle of the heath every day, and he looks all round to see if there's anyone about, and if there isn't, he takes his collar off. The editor interrupted, which is considered rude, and said, You're not romancing? I beg your pardon, said Oswald. Drawing the longbow, I mean, said the editor. Oswald drew himself up and said he wasn't a liar. The editor only laughed and said romancing and lying were not at all the same, only it was important to know what you were playing at. So Oswald accepted his apology and went on. We were hiding among the furze bushes one day and we saw him do it. He took off his collar and he put on a clean one and he threw the other among the furze bushes. We picked it up afterwards, and it was a beastly paper one. Thank you, said the editor, and he got up and put his hand in his pocket. That's well worth 5 shillings, and there they are. Would you like to see round the printing offices before you go home? I pocketed my 5 bob and thanked him, and I said we should like it very much. He called another gentleman and said something we couldn't hear. Then he said goodbye again, and all this time Noel hadn't said a word, but now he said, I've made a poem about you. It's called Lines to a Noble Editor. Shall I write it down? The editor gave him the blue pencil, and he sat down at the editor's table and wrote. It was this, he told me afterwards as well as he could remember. May life's choicest blessings be your lot. I think you ought to be very blessed, for you are going to print my poems, and you may have this one as well as the rest. Thank you, said the editor. I don't think I ever had a poem addressed to me before. I shall treasure it, I assure you. Then the other gentleman said something about McKenna's, which I have no idea what that is, and we went off to see the printing office with at least £1.7 in our pockets. It was good hunting and no mistake, but he never put Noel's poetry in the Daily Recorder. It was quite a long time afterwards we saw a sort of story thing in a magazine on the station bookstall, and that kind, sleepy-looking editor had written it, I suppose. It was not at all amusing. It said a lot about Noel and me, and describing us all wrong, and saying how we had tea with the editor, and all Noel's poems were in the story thing. I think myself the editor seemed to make a game of them, but Noel was quite pleased to see them in print, so that's all right. Wasn't my poetry anyhow, I'm glad to say. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm going to stop there because my voice is starting to feel a little bit tickly, sorry. So that's 3 chapters today. So have you got some fun things that you're going to do with the rest of your day? I'm going to cook dinner, and I'm going to finish putting away the rest of the groceries, the ones that didn't need to go into the fridge and the freezer. Such excitement. Anyway, so we'll see you next time. Don't forget that you can join my Discord server if you haven't already, and it's very quiet, but if you join us, maybe we'll get a bit more chatty. Come over, say hi, tell us a little bit about yourself, what part of the world that you live in. You don't need to get too specific. You can say New Zealand or the States or Northland, New Zealand. You can get a bit more specific, but you don't need to get too specific. And if you get any ideas that you think that would be a really cool story to listen to, write it down in the Discord server so I can know all about it and share it with you. Hi Z-Dog, how are you? So I can consider, see if I can find a copy of it and I can read it sometime. Also, if you're listening to a story and you think this reminds me of a particular place, or it looked a bit like this, and you find a picture like that in online, Google or whatever, you can share it in the Discord server and say, this reminds me of when we were reading about this, which is a fun way to actually help us to visualize it, see how other people see things. You can also, if you want to hear some more of the stories that I've read previously, because these stay here for 2 weeks and then I put them over on YouTube, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is also linked down below, and what you can do over there is you can actually go to one of my playlists and listen to a whole story from start to finish. Chapter 6, Noel's Princess. She happened quite accidentally. We were not looking for a princess at all just then, but Noel had said he was going to find a princess all by himself and marry her. And he really did, which is rather odd because when people say things are going to befall, very often they don't. It was different, of course, with the prophets of old. We did not get any treasure by it except 12 chocolate drops, but we might have done, and it was an adventure anyhow. Greenwich Park is a jolly good place to play in, especially the parts that aren't near Greenwich. The parts near the Heath are first rate. I often wish the park was nearer our house. But I suppose a park is a difficult thing to move. Sometimes we get Eliza to put lunch in a basket and we go to the park. She likes that. It saves cooking dinner for us, and sometimes she says of her own accord, "I've made some pasties for you and you might as well go into the park as not. It's a lovely day." She always tells us to rinse out the cup at the drinking fountain, and the girls do, but I always put my head under the tap and drink. Then you are an intrepid hunter at a mountain stream, and besides, you're sure it's clean. Dickie does the same, and so does H.O., but Noel always drinks out of the cup. He says it is a golden goblet wrought by enchanted gnomes. The day the princess happened was a fine hot day last October, and we were quite tired with the walk up to the park. We always go in by the little gate at the top of Crooms Hill. It is the postern gate that things always happen at in stories. It was dusty walking, but when we got into the park it was ripping, so we rested a bit and lay on our backs and looked up at the trees and wished we could play monkeys. I've done it before now, but the park keeper makes a row if he catches you. He doesn't want people swinging through the trees at the park because of the fact that you might be damaging the trees. So, anyway. It's one of those things. When we'd rested a little, Alice said, "It's a long way to the enchanted wood. But it's very nice now that we're there. I wonder what we shall find in it." "We shall find deer," said Dickie, "if we go to look, but they go on the other side of the park because of the people with buns," which is a little bit odd. I'm thinking that the people with buns are the ones who are going there picnicking, and so they're a bit noisy. So saying buns made us think of lunch, so we had it, and then when we had done, we scratched a hole under a tree and buried the papers, because we know it spoils pretty places to leave beastly greasy papers lying about. I remember mother teaching me that. And when we were quite little, I wish everybody's parents would teach them this useful lesson, and the same about orange peel. When we'd eaten everything there was, Alice whispered, "I see the white witch bear yonder among the trees. Let's track it and slay it in its lair." "I am the bear," said Noel. So he crept away and we followed him among the trees. Often the witch bear was out of sight, and then you didn't know where it would jump out from, but sometimes we saw it and just followed. "When we catch it, there'll be a great fight," said Oswald, "and I shall be Count Folko of Mount Falcon." "I'll be Gabrielle," said Dora. She is the only one of us who likes doing girls' parts. "I'll be Sintram," said Alice, "and H.O. can be the little master." I'm guessing these are all characters from books that they've been reading. "What about Dickie?" "Oh, I can be the pilgrim with the bones." "Hist," whispered Alice. "See his white fairy fur gleaming amid yonder covert." And I saw a bit of white too. It was Noel's collar, and it had come undone at the back. We hunted the bear in and out of the trees, and then we lost him altogether, and suddenly we found the wall of the park, in a place where I'm sure there wasn't a wall before, which would make me think that they've actually ended up travelling in a direction that they don't normally travel in. Noel wasn't anywhere about, and there was a door in the wall, and it was open, so we went through. "The bear has hidden himself in these mountain fastnesses," Oswald said. "I will draw my good sword and after him." So I drew the umbrella, which Dora always will bring in case it rains, because Noel gets a cold on his chest at the least thing, and we went on. The other side of the wall was a stable yard, all cobblestones. There was nobody about, but we could hear a man rubbing down a horse and hissing in the stable, so we crept very quietly past, and Alice whispered, "'Tis the lair of the monster serpent. I hear his deadly hiss. Beware! Courage and dispatch." We went over the stones on tiptoe and we found another wall with another door in it on the other side. We went through that too. On tiptoe, it really was an adventure, and there we were in the shrubbery, and we saw something white through the trees. Dora said it was the white bear. That is so like Dora. She always begins to take part in a play just when the rest of us are getting tired of it. I don't mean this unkindly, because I'm very fond of Dora. I cannot forget how kind she was when I had bronchitis, and ingratitude is a dreadful vice. Sorry, I went and lost it again. I have ADHD. I get easily distracted. Ingratitude is a dreadful vice, but it is quite true. It's not a bear, said Oswald, and we all went on, still on tiptoe, round a twisty path and onto a lawn. And there was Noel. His collar had come undone, as I had said, and he had an inky mark on his face that he had made just before we left the house, and he wouldn't let Dora wash it off, and one of his bootlaces was coming down. He was standing looking at a little girl. She was the funniest little girl you ever saw. She was like a china doll, the sixpenny kind. She had a white face and long yellow hair done up very tight in 2 pigtails. Her forehead was very big and lumpy, and her cheeks came high up like little shelves under her eyes. Her eyes were small and blue. She had on a funny black frock with curly braid on it, and button boots that went up almost to her knees. Her legs were very thin. She was sitting in a hammock chair nursing a blue kitten. Not a sky blue one, of course, but the colour of a new slate pencil. That's what they call that colour of blue. Is referred to, that colour of grey for a cat is called blue. Noel had forgotten the colour of a new slate pencil. As we came up, we heard her say to Noel, "Who are you?" Noel had forgotten about the bear, and he was taking his favourite part, so he said, "I'm Prince Camaralzaman." The little girl looked pleased. "I thought at first you were a common boy," she said. Then she saw the rest of us and said, "Are you all princes and princesses too?" Of course we said yes, and she said, "I'm a princess also." She said it very well too, exactly as if it was true. We were very glad, because it's so seldom you meet any children who can begin to play right off without having everything explained to them. And even then they will say they are going to pretend to be a lion or a witch or a king. Now this little girl just said, "I am a princess." Then she looked at Oswald and said, "I fancy I've seen you at Baden." Of course Oswald said, "Very likely." The little girl had a funny voice, and all her words were quite plain, each word by itself. She didn't talk at all like we do. H.O. asked her what the cat's name was, and she said, "Katinka." Then Dickie said, "Let's get away from the windows. If you play near windows, someone inside generally knocks on them and says, 'Don't.'" The princess put down the cat very carefully and said, "I am forbidden to walk off the grass." "That's a pity," said Dora. "But I will if you like," said the princess. "You mustn't do things you are forbidden to, Dora," Dora said, but Dickie showed us that there was some more grass beyond the shrubs with only a gravel path between. So I lifted the princess over the gravel so that she should be able to say she hadn't walked off the grass. When we had got to the other grass, we all sat down, and the princess asked us if we liked draggees. I know that's how you spell it, for I asked Uncle Albert next door's uncle, Dragees. That's something for you to look up. We said we thought not, but she pulled a real silver box out of her pocket and showed us. They were just flat, round chocolates. We had 2 each. Then we asked her name, and she began. And when she began, she went on and on and on, till I thought she was never going to stop. H.O. said she had 50 names. But Dickie is very good at figures, and he says there were only 18. The first were Pauline, Alexandra, Alice, and Mary was one, and Victoria, for we all heard that. And it ended up with Hildegard, Cunegonde, something or other, princess of something else. When she had done, H.O. said, "That's jolly good. Say it again." And she did, but even then we couldn't remember it. We told her our names, but she thought they were too short, so when it was Noel's turn, he said he was Prince Noel Camaralzaman, Ivan, Constantine, Charlemagne, James, John, Edward, Biggs, Maximilian, Bastable, Prince of Lewisham. But when she asked him to say it again, of course, he could only get the first two names right because he'd made it up as he went on. So the princess said, "You are quite old enough to know your own name." She was very grave and serious. She told us that she was the 5th cousin of Queen Victoria. We asked who the other cousins were, but she did not seem to understand. Actually, yeah, the 5th cousin, that's a certain relationship type, not how many cousins there are. She went on and said she was 7 times removed. She couldn't tell us what that meant either, but Oswald thinks it meant that the Queen's cousins are so fond of her that they will keep coming bothering, so the Queen's servants have orders to remove them. This little girl must have been very fond of the Queen to try so often to see her, and to have been 7 times removed. We could see that it was considered something to be proud of, but we thought it was hard on the Queen that her cousins wouldn't let her alone. Now, I have cousins who live down the road, and I have known them all my life, and I know them better than a lot of people know their cousins. But these cousins are not my first cousins, which is what most people think of as cousins. These cousins are my 3rd cousins, which means that they and I are 3rd cousins, which means our parents are 2nd cousins, which means their parents are 1st cousins, which means that their parents are brothers and sisters. That's how cousins numbers work. And then the removed is generations on one side or another. So you might be at the same level for like 2nd cousins, but once removed means one of you is the next generation down, or down. So 2nd cousins once removed is this way. It doesn't go up because that would be 1st cousins once removed. Well, sorry, 1st cousins once removed. It's weird, but it works if you see it on paper. Anyway, so they weren't used to this at all. Presently the little girl asked us where our maids and governesses were. We told her we hadn't any just now, and she said, "How pleasant! And did you come here alone?" "Yes," said Dora, "we came across the heath." "You are very fortunate," said the little girl. She sat very upright on the grass with her fat little hands in her lap. "I should like to go on the heath. There are donkeys there with white saddle covers. I should like to ride them, but my governess will not permit." "I'm glad we haven't a governess," H.O. said. "We ride the donkeys whenever we have any pennies, and once I gave the man another penny to make it gallop." "You are indeed fortunate," said the princess again, and she looked sad. And when she looked sad, the shelves on her cheeks showed more than ever. You could have laid a 6pence on them quite safely if you had had one. "Never mind," said Noel. "I've got a lot of money. Come out and have a ride now." But the little girl shook her head and said she was afraid it would not be correct. Dora said she was quite right. Then all of a sudden came one of those uncomfortable times when nobody can think of anything to say, so we sat and looked at each other. But at last Alice said we ought to be going. "Do not go yet," the little girl said. "At what time did they order your carriage?" "Our carriage is a fairy one, drawn by griffins, and it comes when we wish for it," said Noel. The little girl looked at him very queerly and said, "That is out of a picture book." Then Noel said he thought it was about time he was married if we were to be home in time for tea. The little girl was rather stupid over it, but she did what we told her, and we married them with Dora's pocket handkerchief for a veil, and the ring off the back of one of the buttons on H.O.'s blouse just went on her little finger. Then we showed her how to play cross-touch and Puss in the Corner and tag. It was funny, she didn't know any games but battledore and shuttlecock, and Les Graces. So battledore and shuttlecock is what we now call badminton. But she really began to laugh at last and not look quite so like a doll. She was Puss and was running after Dicky when suddenly she stopped short and looked as if she was going to cry, and we looked too, and there were 2 prim ladies with little mouths and tight hair. One of them said in quite an awful voice, "Pauline, who are these children?" And her voice was gruff, with very curly R's. The little girl said we were princes and princesses, which was silly to a grown-up person. That's not a great friend of yours. The gruff lady gave a short, horrid laugh like a husky bark and said, "Princes indeed, they're only common children." Dora turned very red and began to speak, but the little girl cried out, Common children? Oh, I am so glad. When I am grown up, I will always play with common children." And she ran at us and began to kiss us one by one, beginning with Alice. She had got to H.O. when the horrid lady said, "Your Highness, go indoors at once." The little girl answered, "I won't." Then the prim lady said, "Wilson, carry her Highness indoors." And the little girl was carried away, screaming and kicking with her thin little legs and her button boots, and between her screams she shrieked, "Common children, I am glad, glad, glad! Common children, common children!" The nasty lady then remarked, "Go at once or I will send for the police." So we went. H.O. made a face at her, and so did Alice, but Oswald took off his cap and said he was sorry if she was annoyed about anything, for Oswald has always been taught to be polite to ladies, however nasty. Dickie took his off too when he saw me do it. He says he did it first, but that is a mistake. If I were really a common boy, I would say it was a lie. Then we all came away, and when we got outside, Dora said, "So she was really a princess. Fancy a princess living there." "Even princesses have to live somewhere," said Dickie, and I thought it was play, and it was real. I wish I'd known. "I should have liked to ask her lots of things," said Alice. H.O. said he would have liked to ask her what she had for dinner and whether she had a crown. I felt myself we had lost a chance of finding out a great deal about kings and queens. I might have known such a stupid-looking little girl would never have been able to pretend as well as that. So we all went home across the heath and made dripping toast for tea. When we were eating it, Noel said, "I wish I could give her some. It is very good." He sighed as he said it, and his mouth was very full, so we knew he was thinking of his princess. He says now that she was as beautiful as the day, but we remember her quite well, and she's nothing of the kind. And that's the end of that chapter, and I am actually going to stop there. Sorry, it's now nearly 4:30.